I've always been a straight-A student. I've always loved school. I think it's because there's a clear path to achievement with grades, tests, and graduation. Or maybe it's because it feels like a box that I fit into. It's cozy and comforting. But that comfort doesn't last forever. This is a photograph of me graduating from one of the top photojournalism departments in the country. When my friends and I walked across the stage, they all had jobs and internships at major publications like the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post. But when I walked across the stage, I didn't have a plan. I had no idea what I wanted my life to look like post-graduation. And so I moved in with my boyfriend. We closed our eyes and picked a place on the map and wound up in Portland, Maine. I read a lot of Outside magazine articles. And I became a stereotypical millennial. College educated, I had internships and study abroad programs under my belt, and I was working as a server right down the street. I was realizing that the comfort of school didn't exist in the real world. During this time, my mother told me, "You do what you love when no one's watching." And so as I started to figure out what I wanted to do with my life after graduation, I started to ask myself what was pulling at my heartstrings. When no one was watching, I was listening to a lot of podcasts. If you don't know what a podcast is, it's basically a radio show online. There are 350,000 of them. And so, in a world where there's so much noise, these audio stories struck me because they made me fall in love with people whose faces I would never see and who I would never meet. And I decided I wanted to be a creator of what I was consuming. I wanted to be a radio journalist and producer. The only problem was that I had never made a radio story before in my life. And so all of a sudden there was a huge gap between where I was and where I wanted to be, and I didn't know how to bridge those. In photojournalism, they teach you if you want to be a photographer, you can't tell people, you have to show people. So I decided to take that same approach and place it on becoming a radio journalist and producer. At the end of 2014, in December, instead of making a list of New Year's resolutions, I decided to make my own grad school program, equipped with a syllabus that was 7 pages long. In this syllabus was a thesis project, a podcast called Millennial. Millennial is about maneuvering your 20s post-graduation through the eyes of one person, me. It was a means to an end. I wanted to use Millennial as a portfolio piece so that I could get a job in the industry. And so as I was serving and working on this podcast and having another part-time job, I was also sending out applications to fellowships, internships, and jobs all over the country. I applied to This American Life and was a top finalist, but then got rejected. I applied to the Kroc Fellowship with NPR, was flown out to DC for an interview, and then was rejected. I applied to a podcasting company in New York City for an internship, and then was rejected because they told me I was overqualified. But every single time, I fell back on Millennial. I kept making the podcast despite all of these disappointments. Until finally, I got a call. It was from New Hampshire Public Radio. They had listened to the podcast, and they were offering me a job as a full-time producer. When I got this call, I felt like I had arrived. Like that same sensation I had when I was graduating, I felt it at this moment. I felt like I had graduated into adulthood, and I had found another box that I fit into that was comfortable and secure and came with a 401k, salary, benefits. And I should have stopped making Millennial. Like I said, it was a means to an end. This was the end. But I couldn't stop making it. I realized during my few months at my job that this box I had worked so hard to fit into had a ceiling on it. There were limitations, things I could and could not do. And for the first time, I realized that in my closet, where I was making Millennial, there was so much freedom. And so I started to live this double life between my full-time job, making this passion project. I would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and work on the podcast, and then I'd go to work, and I'd come home, have dinner, then keep working on the podcast until 11 or sometimes 3 a.m., and then I'd repeat the cycle. I was doing it for me because I loved it. And at a moment when I thought that no one was listening, it turned out everyone was listening. At the end of December in 2015, I got a Twitter notification that The Atlantic had created a list of top 50 podcasts throughout the whole world, and Millennial was number 14. During this time, companies were also contacting me to become sponsors. And pretty soon, Millennial was growing at a rate that I couldn't keep up with having a full-time job. And so I found myself at a crossroads between taking this traditional path, fitting into this box that felt really comfortable and cozy, or taking a leap and possibly risking this comfortable path for something that I loved and committing myself to it full time. After months of thought, I went to my boss and told her I was quitting. I knew that if I didn't pursue Millennial full time, I would regret it for the rest of my life. This is what I came home to on my last day of work. My boyfriend made it for me in celebration of taking this big leap. I grew up with a phrase from a Buddhist philosopher, Daisaku Ikeda, and it goes, when you commit yourself and you make a big determination and you move in that direction, every cell and nerve in your body will start to move in that direction. And that's what happened. I decided to commit to Millennial full time, and a week after I quit, I got a call from a network in Boston. And then I got another call from a network in New York City. They both wanted to pick up the show. In May of this year, I proudly announced Millennial as a 14th edition to Radiotopia, one of the best independent networks for podcasts in the country. When I was walking across that stage 2 years ago, and I didn't have a plan, I could never have told you that I would be my own boss at age 26, or that I would have a show with up to 300,000 listeners a month, or that I would be standing in front of you giving this TED Talk. And that's because the job that I have, I didn't learn about in school. I created it myself. The funny thing is that I'm still in a box. In my closet right here in Portland, Maine, making Millennial. But this box doesn't have a ceiling. It's a place where the growth for me and the show is limitless. Thank you.